Shutter speed is measured in time. This is 1,000th of a second, this is 1/60th of a second. If we lengthen that time further to where it can't be measured in fractions anymore, that's where these marks come in. This is half a second, this is 30 seconds. If all you see is a number, assume it's the denominator of a fraction because it doesn't have those marks. These units of time refer to how long any part of your sensor is exposed to light when an image is captured. That wording is important because changing your shutter speed doesn't actually change the speed of your shutter. To understand this, let's look at the two different kinds of shutter: rolling shutter and global shutter. Rolling shutter uses two curtains. The first moves to expose the sensor to light, then the other follows to cover it. So that's the shutter, but what about speed? As you start increasing the shutter speed, the curtains don't actually move faster. Instead, the second curtain just doesn't wait as long to follow the first curtain. There are downsides to this method. Since the top of the image was captured before the bottom, if anything in frame is moving too quickly in relation to the camera, it can suffer from distortion. A global shutter, also called electronic shutter, ditches the shutter altogether in favor of technology that allows the entire sensor to be turned on and off simultaneously. This eliminates the distortions inherent to rolling shutter. Few cameras today use global shutter, but some film cameras have already made the switch, and as technology progresses, pro DSLRs could follow. Regardless of what kind of shutter you have, the basic principles of short and long exposure are the same. Short exposures are good for getting crisp shots of fast-moving subjects, though less time letting in light means a darker image, so you'll likely have to compensate with a wider aperture or higher ISO. A good starting point for freezing subjects in action would be anywhere from 1/500th to 1/1250th of a second, going higher if needed. Most DSLRs will cap at either 1/4000th or 1/8000th of a second. Long exposures have the opposite effect. The camera lets in light over a longer period of time. This means anything in motion during the exposure will leave a trail of where it's been. Because you can capture more light, long exposures are great for night photography. But if you try to take one during daylight, you'll find your aperture doesn't go narrow enough and your ISO doesn't go low enough to stop your photo from being overexposed. This is where you can use ND filters to decrease the amount of light coming into your lens, allowing for you to expose longer under brighter conditions. Make sure to keep your camera locked down on a tripod for these photos, as motion during the exposure can ruin a shot. Most cameras limit long exposures to 30 seconds. If that isn't enough, using a remote shutter release on bulb mode will let you expose longer. Just figure out how many stops underexposed you are at 30 seconds, then double the exposure time for each stop. This only works if the light is not changing, so sunrise and sunset will require more consideration. If you don't want to go into either extreme and just want a fast, crisp photo that doesn't lose out on light, set your shutter speed to a minimum of 1 divided by your focal length. At 50mm, that means 1/50th of a second, and at 200mm, that means 1/200th of a second. This rule isn't set in stone, so feel free to make your own adjustments. For video, we use the 180-degree rule, where your shutter speed is set to half your frame rate to simulate normal motion blur. At 24 frames per second, that means 1/50th of a second, and at 60 frames per second, that means 1/120th of a second. ND filters can also be useful here. This rule can be broken, like it famously was in the movie Saving Private Ryan, but generally isn't. And lastly, if you're looking to half or double your shutter speed to adjust it by a stop, know that the fractions you see are actually rounded versions of the real times. Instead of these numbers, we see these ones, which means 30-second exposures are actually 32 seconds? Yeah, they are.